My grandmother left me a broken-down clock repair shop on the edge of town. My cousin got the house, the savings, and everything else. My husband laughed out loud at the will reading. Didn't even try to hide it. That night, I sat alone inside that dusty little shop, and what I found in the back room changed everything I thought I knew about my grandmother and about myself. But let me start from the beginning. My grandmother's name was Margaret. Everyone called her Nana Meg. She was small, quiet, the kind of woman who always smelled like lavender and old paper. She repaired clocks for 40 years out of a narrow storefront on Grover Street, just outside the main part of town. People thought it was a dying business. Maybe it was. She never seemed to care. She passed away in February, 2 weeks after her 81st birthday. I was 31 years old, working part-time at a dental office, married for 4 years, living in a house we were still fighting to keep up with the mortgage on. My cousin Darren had been her favorite. Everyone knew it. He visited more, called more, helped her with groceries in her last few years. I visited when I could, which was never enough, and I knew that. So when we sat down for the will reading, I was not expecting much. I told myself that before we even walked in. I told my husband just so we were on the same page. He nodded like he agreed, but I could feel the way he was sitting, leaning slightly forward, hands on his knees. He was expecting something. The lawyer read through the list. The house went to Darren. The savings account, which was more than any of us expected, went to Darren. The small jewelry collection went to my aunt. Some furniture to a neighbor who had helped Nana Meg during her last months. And then, at the very end, almost like a footnote, the clock repair shop and its contents at 114 Grover Street to my granddaughter, Nina. That was me. I sat very still. My husband made a sound. Not a word. Just a short exhale through his nose that said everything he did not want to say out loud in front of the lawyer. I felt it land on me like something dropped from a height. Darren looked over with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not mean. Just confused, like he wasn't sure what to do with his face. On the drive home, my husband was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then he said, "A clock shop." I said, "Yes." He said, "She left you a clock shop." I said, "That's what the lawyer said." He said, "Nina, that place has been barely open for 3 years. She wasn't even running it at the end. It's probably falling apart." He paused. He wasn't wrong. And then he said, "I just thought you were her only granddaughter." I thought there would be something real. I didn't answer. Something real. I stared at the window and watched the highway go by. That night after dinner, my husband called his brother. I could hear them in the other room. He wasn't yelling. He was just talking in that flat, factual tone that's somehow worse than yelling. "She got the shop. The old clock place." "Yeah, I know." He laughed once, softly, like it was embarrassing. I went to bed before he came back in. 3 days later, I drove to Grover Street by myself. I didn't tell him where I was going. I told myself it was just to see the condition of the place, figure out what to do with it, whether to sell or let the lease run out or whatever came next. The shop was narrow and deep, sandwiched between a closed barber shop and a Vietnamese restaurant. The sign above the door still said Meg's Clock and Watch Repair in faded gold letters. The window display had 3 old clocks in it, all stopped at different times. The key the lawyer had given me was small and silver. It took me 2 tries to get the door open. The hinges creaked. The smell hit me before my eyes adjusted. Wood polish, metal, something faintly sweet that I couldn't name but recognized immediately. That was Nana Meg. That was exactly what her house had smelled like when I was a child. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Inside, the shop was exactly as she had left it. The glass cases along the walls held dozens of clocks. Pocket watches, wall clocks, mantel clocks, a few antique pieces with labels still on them. Her work table was in the back behind the counter, still covered in tiny tools, tweezers, small screwdrivers, magnifying glasses on flexible arms. A half-repaired watch was still sitting in the center of the mat, like she had just stepped away for a moment and was about to come back. I walked slowly. I touched the edge of the counter. I looked at the back wall, which was covered floor to ceiling in shelves of clocks. Some were ticking. Some were silent. I sat down in her chair. It was an old wooden stool, padded on top with a piece of foam she had duct-taped into place years ago. I remembered sitting on it as a child when she would let me watch her work. I was maybe 7 or 8. She would hold a tiny gear up to the light and say, "See that, Nina? Everything has a gear like this. Tiny. Easy to overlook. But pull it out and the whole thing stops." I sat there for a while. I wasn't sure how long. Then I started looking around more carefully, the way you do when you're alone in a place and there's no one watching. I opened the drawers under the counter. Most of them had supplies. Watch straps, spare batteries, cleaning cloths, little bags of parts sorted by size. Ordinary stuff. The kind of drawer contents you'd expect. The last drawer on the right was stuck. I had to pull hard. When it finally came open, there was a small envelope inside, sitting on top of a folded piece of paper. The envelope had my name on it, written in Nana Meg's handwriting. Nina. Not Nina and family. Not to whom it may concern, just Nina. My hands went still. I picked it up. The envelope was sealed but light, no money, no key, nothing with weight inside, just paper. I sat back down on the stool and opened it slowly, the way you open something you're not sure you're ready for. Inside was a single card. The front had a small printed image of a clock face. Inside she had written, "Nina, you always stayed to watch. The others got tired of it. You never did. Look under the work table. The box that looks like it's just a base. It's not just a base." I'm sorry I didn't explain while I could. I ran out of time. Nana Meg. I read it 3 times. Then I got down on my knees on the old wood floor and looked under the work table. There was a wooden box there, built into the underside of the table, flush against the wall. I would never have noticed it. It looked exactly like part of the table's structure, a thick rectangular base that supported the back legs. But when I pushed on the right side, the front panel came loose. It swung open on small hinges. Inside, a metal document box, the kind with a handle on top. No lock. I pulled it out and sat it on the table. I opened the lid. There were papers inside, folded documents, a small journal with a rubber band around it, and underneath everything, a thick envelope sealed with tape labeled in her writing, "Read the journal first." I picked up the journal. It was not a diary, it wasn't personal entries about her days, it was more like notes, records she had kept over years, dates and names and dollar amounts, descriptions of items, contact information for people I didn't recognize. The first entry was from 11 years ago. She had been approached by a company, a development group, about the building, not just the shop. The entire building at 114 Grover Street. At the time, she had refused. She wrote, "They want the land, not the clocks." I told them I would think about it. "I will not think about it. I will not think about it." Over the years, they came back. Different representatives, same company. Each time the offer was larger. Each time she declined. The most recent entry was from 8 months ago, when she was already sick. The offer by then was substantial. I don't want to write the exact number here, but when I saw it, I had to put the journal down and breathe for a moment. I went back to the papers. The building at 114 Grover Street sat at a corner that the city had been quietly acquiring around for years. Not Grover Street itself. The street behind it. The alley. There were letters from the city planning department in that envelope. Proposed commercial corridor. Revised zoning. A transit expansion that would run directly behind the block. Nana Meg had owned not just the shop, but the building. And attached to the building was a narrow strip of land running along the back. A service alley that she owned outright, which she had never mentioned to anyone that I knew of. That strip of land was exactly where the city wanted to run a connecting road to a new development hub 3 blocks over. She had been contacted by the city too. The letters were there. Politely worded, persistent. She had responded to none of them. Why didn't she sell? At the back of the journal, on the last written page, she had left a note that felt like it was meant for me specifically. Maybe it was. She wrote, "The first time they came, I thought about selling. I could have retired comfortably, but I watched what happened to the Delancey lot when they sold. And the corner where the pharmacy was. All of it went to glass buildings that don't belong here. I didn't want that for this block. But I'm 80 years old and I won't be here to decide forever. So I'm leaving it to the one person I trust to think before she acts. You used to watch me work for hours without asking me to hurry up. That is a rare quality, Nina. Use it now. I sat at her work table until it was almost dark outside. The clocks ticked around me. The one above the door had a pendulum that swung back and forth in a slow, even rhythm I hadn't noticed until the shop got quiet enough for me to hear it. I put everything back in the metal box. I put the box back in the hidden compartment. I closed the panel. Then I drove home and I didn't say a word. My husband was watching something in the living room when I got in. He asked where I'd been. I said I stopped by the shop. He said, "Oh," and turned back to the TV. He didn't ask what it was like. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He had already filed the shop away in his mind as something not worth his attention. That was fine. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea and stood at the window and thought about my grandmother working in that shop for 4 decades. Refusing offers, writing notes, building something slow and patient that no one could see yet. The next morning, I called the city planning office. I gave them the property address. I asked if there were any active development plans that affected 114 Grover Street or the adjacent parcel. There was a pause, some typing. The woman who answered said, "Yes. That address is flagged as an affected parcel in the Route 9 commercial corridor expansion. We've been trying to reach the property owner." I told her the property owner had passed away and that I was the new owner. Another pause. She said, "You'll want to speak with our development liaison. There are several interested parties." I thanked her and hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a while after that. Just standing. Not crying. Not jumping around. Just very, very still, the way you get when something big lands on you softly. 2 days later, I called a real estate attorney. I didn't tell my husband. I told him I had an errand, and I went to the attorney's office with the metal box and the journal and all the documents from the hidden compartment, and I sat across from a woman named, well, I'll call her my attorney, and I laid everything out on her desk. She looked through the papers carefully. She asked a few questions. Then she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Do you understand what this land is worth in the current zoning proposal?" I said I had an idea. She said, "The strip parcel alone, in a transit-adjacent commercial zone, is more than most people see in a lifetime. The building adds to that considerably." She also said, "None of this is marital property. You inherited it. In this state, inheritance is separate property. Your husband has no claim to any of it." I nodded. I had already looked that up. I told her I wanted to understand all my options before I made any decisions. I told her I was not in a hurry. She smiled a little. She said, "That's the right approach." A week later, a representative from the development company called the number listed on the property documents. I had left a message with their office after finding the contact information in Nana Meg's files. His name was, I'll call him the developer. He was professional, smooth, the kind of person who has done this 100 times. He started with a number that was already higher than any offer in my grandmother's records. I said, "I appreciate the call. I'm still reviewing my options." He said they were on a timeline with the city approvals. I said I understood. I said I would be in touch. I did not call my husband from the parking lot. I drove home, made dinner, and listened to him talk about his day. That weekend, his parents came over for Sunday lunch. His mother was warm, but the kind of warm that always has a question underneath it. Over salad, she asked how I was handling everything, meaning Nana Meg's passing, and also meaning I could hear it. "What are you going to do with that shop?" My husband answered before I could. He said, "She's figuring it out. Probably going to sell the contents and let the lease expire." I looked at my plate. His father nodded. "Probably smart," he said. "Old location like that, hard to do much with it." I said, "Maybe," and I passed the bread. 3 weeks later, I had met with 2 additional development groups, all of whom had found my contact information through the city liaison office. Each offer was larger than the last. I had also spoken with the city planner directly, who explained the full scope of the transit expansion and what commercial zoning in that corridor would mean for a property owner who retained partial stake rather than selling outright. That option, retaining partial stake, was the one my attorney kept coming back to. She explained it this way. You don't have to sell the land to benefit from it. If you negotiate a development partnership rather than a straight sale, you stay in as a stakeholder. The income over time could significantly exceed a single sale. I thought about Nana Meg's last note. The one about the Delancey lot and the pharmacy corner and the glass buildings that didn't belong. I negotiated. It took another 6 weeks. There were meetings and revised terms and phone calls I took in my car in the parking lot of the dental office. My husband thought I was doing paperwork for the estate. I let him think that, not out of deception for its own sake, but because I had learned something sitting in that shop alone with her clocks and her journals. Some things need to be decided in quiet before they can be announced in noise. By the time I was ready to tell him, the partnership agreement was signed. The terms were better than the initial full sale offer by a meaningful margin. My attorney had done her job. Nana Meg's 4 decades of refusals had done theirs. I told him on a Thursday evening after dinner, when the dishes were done and there was nothing else to distract from the conversation. I said, I need to show you something. He sat at the kitchen table. I put the folder in front of him, not the original documents, copies my attorney had prepared for exactly this moment. He opened the folder. He looked at the summary page. He read the number on the partnership agreement. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "This is from the shop." I said, "From the shop and the property attached to it?" "Yes." He looked up. His expression was something I didn't have a name for right away. It wasn't anger. It wasn't joy. It was something more like recalibration, like a clock being set back to the right time. He said, "How long have you known?" I said, "A few months." He said, "And you didn't tell me." I said I needed to understand it myself first, and I needed to make decisions without, I paused, without the noise. I said, he knew what I meant. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment and then back at me. He said, I laughed at the will reading. I said, I know. He said, I made that sound in the car. I said, I made that sound in the car. I said, I know. He didn't apologize. Not then. But something shifted in the kitchen that night, something in the air between us. He picked up the folder again and read through I think about that moment a lot, the one in the car, right after the will reading, when my husband made that sound. Not even a word. Just a breath through his nose that said everything he thought about me and what I had just inherited. A broken clock shop. An embarrassment. Something to get rid of. He didn't know that sound would stay with me for months. That I would think about it sitting alone in Nana Meg's shop at midnight, surrounded by clocks that were still ticking even though she was gone. Here's what I've come to understand. Looking back at all of it, the outcomes in our lives are rarely random. They are usually the result of choices piled on top of each other over years in ways that are invisible until suddenly they're not. My grandmother chose to stay in that shop for 40 years when everyone thought she was foolish for it. She chose to refuse every offer when the easy thing would have been to take the money and walk away. She chose to watch and wait and trust that patience was its own kind of strategy. Those choices, quiet, unsexy, made without any audience, produced something extraordinary. Not because the universe rewarded her goodness, but because she understood something most people don't, that real value takes time to reveal itself, and most people stop looking too early. And my husband, his choices produced something too. Every small dismissal, every moment he chose not to ask me how I was doing, every time he answered for me at someone else's table, those choices were also accumulating. Not as punishment, but as information. Information about who he was and how he saw me and what the architecture of our life together had quietly become. What I learned from all of it isn't that patience gets rewarded. It's that patience gives you time to see clearly. When I sat in that shop alone and read my grandmother's journal, I wasn't receiving some gift I had earned by being virtuous. I was finally sitting still long enough to understand what had been in front of me all along. Nana Meg had been teaching me something my whole life. In the way she held a gear up to the light, in the way she never rushed, in the way she said you read before you act. I had absorbed it without knowing I was absorbing it. That is what real intelligence looks like, I think. Not the kind that scores well on tests or impresses people at dinner. The kind that knows when to move and when to wait. The kind that doesn't need an audience to validate its decisions. Darren was never a bad person. He just moved fast and assumed the most obvious thing was the truest thing. A lot of us do that. And courage. It didn't look the way I expected either. It wasn't dramatic. It was going back to that shop alone 3 days after the will reading when I had no reason to believe there was anything worth finding. It was sitting in my attorney's office with a metal box full of old documents and saying, I want to understand all my options before I decide anything. It was not telling my husband what I knew until I had already made the decisions that needed to be made in quiet. Nana Meg gave me the shop because she believed I could handle what came with it. The uncertainty, the paperwork, the months of meetings and phone calls and sitting with something big before announcing it. She was right. Not because I'm special, but because she had spent years showing me how. I just didn't know I was being taught. The pendulum on her clock swings every Sunday morning when I wind it. I always stop for a second and just watch it. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't fall behind. It just keeps its rhythm, one movement at a time, and the whole thing keeps working. That's all any of us can really do.